At my wedding rehearsal, the heavy oak garden doors swung open. Instead of my bridesmaids, the person who walked in was my own sister. She was arm in arm with Ethan, the man I was supposed to call my husband in less than 24 hours. But what made my chest tighten wasn't her smug smile, it was what she was wearing. The high-end lace wedding gown that I had spent 6 grueling months designing and having custom made was now hugging my sister's body. She walked with utter pride, delicately lifting the hem of the dress exactly the way I had practiced in front of the mirror. My mother stood in the very first row, softly clapping and smiling as if she were witnessing the most romantic moment in the world. My sister's smile was blinding, while Ethan's eyes deliberately avoided my presence. They walked in with the mindset of victors, triumphant in the belief that they had robbed me of my future and my assets. But little did they know, that very night, their entire dignity, careers, and pride would be absolutely crushed by me in a completely legal manner. I am Kristen Harper, 39 years old, a nurse case manager who has spent her life keeping a cool head amidst the absolute panic of others. I once thought Ethan was my safe harbor, and that my sister Valerie was just an impulsive nuisance our family needed to tolerate. I was wrong, but I won't be the one paying the price. Before I continue, wherever you are, I want to know. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this story has captured your attention, hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Being a nurse case manager isn't like being a trauma surgeon or an ER nurse. My job isn't to stop the bleeding immediately or shock a heart back to life in a fraction of a second. My responsibility is to stand on the thin line between medicine, ethics, and the most devastating decisions a family must face. I explain complex treatment protocols, I analyze every potential risk, and I listen. More than anything, I listen. In those cold hospital rooms, I have learned a bare truth about human nature. The one screaming the loudest, crying the most pitifully in the hallway, is rarely the one enduring the deepest pain. They are usually the ones gnawed at by guilt. Through thousands of hours observing families shatter under the pressure of a crisis, I understand that an immediate reaction is never the wisest one. Calmness is not an expression of apathy. I brought that armor of silence into my personal life, especially when dealing with my family. My mother gave birth to 2 daughters, but it seemed in her eyes there was only one. My sister, Valerie, is 3 years older than me, but lives like a woman trapped in the mind of a child who refuses to grow up. Since we were little, Valerie has always craved the center of every spotlight. If I got excellent grades on an important exam, Valerie would suddenly fall ill with a sneeze and a sniffle to draw the whole family's attention. If I worked hard to save money to buy a used car for school, Valerie would beg our mother to buy her one vastly more expensive, claiming she was too sensitive and needed the family's protection. My mother always had one unwavering explanation for all those selfish actions. Valerie lives more through her emotions. Kristen, you are the strong one, so you should yield to your sister. And so I yielded. I used to think my mother's indulgence was just the blind love of an aging parent. But I didn't know that this unconditional indulgence was silently nurturing a toxic envy and a bottomless greed within Valerie. Then I met Ethan. 4 years ago, he walked into my life like a perfect architectural blueprint, square, solid, and incredibly safe. At 35, when the women around me started panicking over the pressure to settle down, the appearance of a calm, professionally stable man like Ethan was like a sturdy anchor thrown into a turbulent sea. He wasn't romantic in the sense of making grand vows, but he paid attention to the little things. He remembered I didn't like my coffee too sweet. He knew how to optimally reorganize my kitchen after I came home exhausted from the hospital. I believed it. I let him into my defensive space, shared my future retirement plans, and finally merged the bank accounts I had built with decades of my youth. But there is one thing working in healthcare has taught me. A healthy body doesn't suddenly collapse without warning signs. Betrayal always leaves a trace. In recent weeks, Ethan began showing the symptoms of a chronic disease called deceit. He frequently worked sudden overtime. His phone was always face down with a changed password, and conversations about our future home dwindled until they vanished completely. He thought he was great at hiding it, but he forgot he was living with someone professionally trained to detect the slightest anomalies in another person's heart rate or breathing. Tonight's rehearsal was held at a stunning vineyard estate in Northern California. The warm yellow light cascaded over the banquet tables draped in pristine white silk, reflecting off the gleaming silver cutlery. The scent of premium wine mixed with climbing roses created an elegant, luxurious, and incredibly expensive atmosphere. Every detail here, from the perfectly aligned wooden chairs to the string quartet playing violins to the dinner menu, was handpicked, arranged, and paid for by me. Ethan said he was pouring all his cash into preparing for a major startup project, so I, with the understanding and sacrifice of a future wife, happily shouldered the entire cost. Standing in the corner of the banquet room, I scanned the area. My close friends, the department heads from the hospital, and a few VIP partners from Ethan's architectural firm were all present. They raised their glasses, chatting cheerfully, convinced that tomorrow they would witness the happy ending of a perfect couple, but the atmosphere within my family was thick with an indescribable unease. Ethan stood 3 paces away from me, constantly rubbing his neck and checking his phone screen. He hadn't looked me in the eye once since we stepped out of the car. Meanwhile, my mother sat in the front row reserved for family, relentlessly wringing a crumpled tissue in her hands. She kept glancing toward the estate entrance with anxious eyes, occasionally muttering to ask if Valerie had arrived yet. My sister had completely vanished for the past 24 hours. She didn't answer my texts, didn't pick up the phone, and of course, was absent without a reason for the hair and makeup trial this morning. A normal guest might think Valerie was just acting irresponsible and running late as usual, but my intuition was ringing fierce alarm bells. The atmosphere tonight gave me the exact same suffocating feeling of the moments right before a patient goes into cardiac arrest. Both Ethan and my mother were carrying a secret. They were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, something they knew for sure would shatter my world. The venerable pastor stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to ask everyone to take their seats so we could begin practicing the vows. The chatter in the room gradually faded, giving way to the solemn silence of a ceremony. I took a deep breath, brushing off the urge to walk over and confront Ethan about what exactly he was hiding. You cannot heal a necrotic wound without letting the abscess burst on its own. I stood with my arms crossed, keeping my breathing steady, my sharp gaze locked straight on the doors. Just as the pastor spoke his first words, a creaking sound shattered the silence. The heavy oak garden doors slowly opened. The light from the chandelier outside poured in, casting the shadows of 2 people standing arm in arm. And in that very moment, I saw the woman walking in none other than my own sister, radiant, proud, and wearing my exact wedding gown. The collective gasp from 75 guests was not the joyous inhalation one expects at a wedding rehearsal. It was a sharp, jagged sound of absolute bewilderment. Through the heavy oak doors stepped my 42-year-old sister, Valerie, her arm threaded intimately through Ethan's. But the visceral shock that paralyzed the room was not merely their physical closeness. It was the fact that Valerie was draped in my wedding dress. This was not an off-the-rack gown she could have easily duplicated. It was a piece of custom ivory lace I had spent 6 months designing, heavily tailored to my exact measurements. Watching her move, I realized with a sickening clarity just how deep her envy ran. She wasn't just wearing my dress, she was wearing my life. She lifted the front hem with her left hand, the exact delicate gesture I had practiced in front of our hallway mirror 3 weeks ago while she sat on my bed, supposedly helping me critique the fit. They strolled down the central aisle of the vineyard, beaming at each other as if they were the triumphant protagonists of a romantic movie, completely disregarding the sanctity of the rehearsal, the presence of his conservative parents, and the fact that I was standing less than 20 feet away. The silence in the room was deafening, thick with secondhand embarrassment and shock. Everyone looked toward me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But before I could even take a breath, a sound shattered the quiet. It was clapping. Slow, rhythmic, tearful clapping coming from the front row. I turned my head. My mother was standing up, a watery, adoring smile plastered across her face. "Oh, Valerie," my mother cooed, her voice trembling with misplaced emotion. "You look absolutely breathtaking." That was the moment the final piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. My mother wasn't just surprised, she was complicit. She had known about this cruel theatrical plan and had actually endorsed it. The sheer horror on the faces of Ethan's parents and my hospital colleagues was palpable. I saw the older women in the room, women who had survived their own share of life's betrayals, exchange knowing, hardened glances. They recognized a cheap affair masquerading as a grand romance, and they stared at my mother as if she had lost her mind. Encouraged by our mother's applause, Valerie stopped in the center of the aisle. She projected her voice, adopting a tone of noble sacrifice. "I know this is a shock to everyone," she announced, placing her hand dramatically over Ethan's chest. But Ethan and I have been deeply in love for months. We tried to fight it. We really did. But true love can't be denied. We realized it would be a bigger lie to let tomorrow happen. So, we are eloping tonight. She looked around the room, genuinely expecting the guests to be moved by her brave pursuit of true happiness. She had framed their deceit, their months of lying, and her theft of my custom gown as an act of romantic courage. Valerie finally locked eyes with me. She braced herself, her chin lifted, eyes wide with the anticipation of a hysterical screaming match. She wanted me to lunge at her. She wanted me to sob, to curse, to tear at her hair so she could play the victim of her unhinged, rigid younger sister. Instead, I did absolutely nothing. Decades of working as a nurse case manager kicked in. When a family member becomes aggressive or hysterical in a hospital waiting room, the worst thing you can do is match their volume. You let them exhaust their own adrenaline. You give them nothing to push against. So I stood perfectly still. I adjusted my posture, clasped my hands loosely in front of me, and offered Valerie a polite, chilling smile. It was the kind of smile you give a toddler who has just proudly presented you with a drawing made of mud. The total lack of an emotional breakdown from me instantly shifted the power dynamic in the room. I could see the exact second Valerie's fantasy began to fracture. Her triumphant smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously around the room, seeking validation that wasn't there. No one else was clapping. The VIP partners from Ethan's firm looked disgusted. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Ethan, who had walked in looking like a conquering hero, suddenly realized the gravity of what he had done in front of his professional superiors. Without my screaming to distract from his betrayal, the room's silent judgment fell entirely on his shoulders. He began to sweat visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, desperately avoiding the searing glare of his senior partner sitting at table 3. They had set the stage for a dramatic soap opera, but I refused to read the script. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I slowly opened my clutch, pulled out my phone, and decided it was time to share the screen. I unlocked my screen. The soft glow illuminated my face as I looked up at the two people who thought they had successfully orchestrated my absolute ruin. The room was so quiet you could hear the gentle rustle of the grapevine leaves in the evening breeze. When I finally spoke, my voice was not a scream. It was a perfectly measured, even tone, the exact cadence I use when explaining a critical diagnosis to a patient's family. "You know, Valerie," I began, my eyes locking onto hers, "for someone who claims to have been agonizing over a forbidden romance for months, you are remarkably bad at hiding your digital footprint. Both of you are." I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "I have known exactly what you two were doing for exactly 30 days. The smug, defiant look on Valerie's face instantly dissolved, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed confusion. Ethan literally took a step backward, his hand dropping from my sister's waist, as if her custom silk dress had suddenly caught fire. I looked at the bewildered faces of Ethan's parents and our guests. A month ago, Ethan came home from a late client dinner and fell straight asleep, leaving his laptop open on the kitchen island. A message notification popped up. I didn't mean to look, but when the sender is listed as Val with a red heart emoji, the eye naturally wanders. I took a slow breath, remembering the visceral, physical shock of that night. When you read the words that destroy your life, your body reacts exactly as it would to physical trauma. My blood pressure plummeted. My hands turned ice cold, and the room spun as if the oxygen had been sucked out of it. My very first instinct was to march into the bedroom, wake him up, and demand answers. But my hospital training held me back. In an emergency, panic is the absolute enemy of survival. I forced myself to breathe. I stood in the dark kitchen for 2 hours, methodically scrolling through months of messages, taking clear photographs of every single exchange with my own phone. I looked out at the older women in the audience, the ones who were nodding slowly in understanding. A woman's intuition is a powerful thing. It is the first symptom that something is wrong. But intuition alone doesn't hold up in court, and it certainly doesn't protect your bank account. Documented proof is undeniable, and it is absolutely necessary for your survival. I tapped my screen and scrolled to a specific folder. "Let me clear up a misconception," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast dining room. "What you are witnessing tonight is not an overwhelming, uncontrollable romance. It is not a brave pursuit of true happiness. It is a calculated financial transaction." I didn't need to shout. The truth was loud enough. I read aloud the message that had permanently extinguished any lingering love I held for the man standing before me. Once we are married, I'll have full access to the joint savings. I can transfer the seed money for the new firm before the end of the year. Kristen won't notice until it's done. And my sister's enthusiastic reply, "Do it. She's too boring to know how to spend that kind of money anyway. We deserve it." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Ethan's mother covered her mouth with trembling hands, weeping quietly in shame. "Love is a beautiful emotion," I continued, speaking not just to Ethan but to everyone listening. "But marriage is a contract. It is a legal and financial partnership, and I absolutely refuse to let my financial future, the money I earned working grueling 12-hour shifts at the hospital, become collateral damage for your cheap, pathetic affair." Ethan was trembling now. The arrogant architect had been reduced to a cornered animal, but I had saved the most lethal dose of reality for last. "If it had only been my money you were planning to steal, Ethan, I might have just quietly canceled the wedding and walked away. But greed is a systemic disease. It rarely isolates itself to just one organ." I turned my gaze away from the altar and looked directly at table 3, right at the front. Sitting there, his face an apoplectic shade of red, was Richard Sterling, the senior partner of Ethan's architectural firm. He was an honored guest, a mentor who had graciously attended to support his rising star. "Richard," I addressed him calmly. "While I was photographing the text regarding my stolen savings, I also found several email attachments Ethan had forwarded to his personal account. It seems his new business plan wasn't just relying on my money. He had also downloaded your firm's entire proprietary VIP client list, complete with private contact information and confidential bidding models, to jumpstart his own competing agency." The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profound. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Richard Sterling did not yell. He stood up slowly, a man in his 60s who did not suffer fools. He buttoned his suit jacket, his eyes fixed on Ethan with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not bother coming into the office tomorrow, Ethan," Richard said, his voice cutting through the courtyard like a steel blade. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, you will be hearing from my legal team by Monday morning. We will ruin you for corporate theft and violation of trade secrets." He picked up his glass of wine, turned on his heel, and walked out of the vineyard. The murmurs erupted instantly. Colleagues whispered, friends stared in disbelief, and Ethan's own father buried his face in his hands. The elegant rehearsal dinner had transformed into a tribunal, and the verdict was unanimous. Ethan tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy breath escaped. He looked at Valerie, but she was entirely useless, her eyes wide with a sudden dawning panic. She had dressed up for a wedding, but she had walked directly into an execution. Ethan stood entirely paralyzed as his career evaporated in seconds, but I was not finished, because my sister still thought she was walking away with a wealthy man. The shockwave of Richard Sterling's departure left a ringing silence in its wake. Ethan's breathing was shallow and erratic, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit as the reality of his ruined career crashed down upon him. But Valerie, having lived her entire life shielded from consequences, still clung to the delusion of her own grand narrative. She was not used to losing, and her ego refused to process the absolute demolition occurring before her very eyes. She lifted her chin, attempting to muster a look of defiant superiority. She adjusted the bodice of my custom lace gown and scoffed, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet vineyard. "Keep your money then, Kristen," Valerie sneered, her voice trembling just enough to betray her panic. "Ethan and I don't need your savings. We have each other. And honestly, since everyone is already here, the catering is paid for, and the pastor is standing right there, we are just going to take over. We'll have our ceremony tonight. You can leave." It was a breathtaking display of audacity. Even my mother, who had applauded them moments ago, looked at Valerie in stunned disbelief. Valerie actually believed the world was a stage built solely for her convenience, where she could simply step into my shoes, wear my dress, eat the food I paid for, and marry the man she stole from me. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached back into my clutch. "Valerie," I said, my tone carrying the gentle, patronizing patience one might use when explaining gravity to a toddler. "Did you really think I would uncover a plot to rob me blind and just leave my assets sitting in a shared vault?" I turned my attention back to the horrified guests, speaking clearly so every woman in the room could hear me. Anticipating Ethan's greed, I paid a quiet visit to the bank exactly 3 weeks ago. I sat down with a financial advisor, handed over 3 years of bank statements, and traced every single penny I had ever deposited. I did not drain the account out of spite. I did not act out of vindictive anger. I executed a precise, legally sound withdrawal of my exact contributions. I looked back at Ethan, whose face had drained of all remaining color. I left you with exactly what you put in, Ethan, which, considering your penchant for expensive lunches and tailored suits, was a meager balance of barely $4,000. Your startup dreams aren't just delayed. Without my capital and without Richard's client list, you are entirely bankrupt. Ethan gripped the back of an empty wooden chair to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. He was a man who had built his identity on the illusion of success, and I had just stripped him down to his absolute pathetic reality. As for your impromptu wedding plans, I continued, turning my steady gaze back to my sister. I pulled a folded document from my bag and held it up. This is the updated venue contract. 2 days ago, I sat down with the estate management. I ensured that the reservation, the catering, and the liability insurance were placed exclusively under my name and my signature alone. You have absolutely no legal rights to this property tonight. Before Valerie could utter another desperate defense, a stern, impeccably dressed woman stepped out from the shadows of the arched stone corridor. It was Mrs. Higgins, the venue manager. She had been standing in the wings, entirely apprised of my preemptive measures. Miss Harper is entirely correct, Mrs. Higgins announced, her voice echoing with unwavering professional authority. She leveled a glacial stare at Valerie and Ethan. This private event is legally contracted to Kristen. If either of you attempts to utilize my staff, my pastor, or my grounds for any sort of unauthorized ceremony, I will not hesitate to call the local authorities and have you escorted off the premises for trespassing. Valerie's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of water. The romantic fantasy she had spun in her head was unraveling thread by thread. There would be no stolen wedding. There would be no glamorous elopement. And just to ensure there are no lingering delusions, I added, delivering the final logistical kill shot, even if you found a public park to stand in tonight, you cannot legally marry. Yesterday afternoon, I visited the county clerk's office and officially canceled the pending marriage license filed under Ethan's and my names. Because the application was never finalized with signatures, it is now void. You have no venue, no money, no career, and absolutely no legal paperwork to tie the knot. I looked at the older women in the audience, catching the eye of a retired head nurse I had worked under for years. She gave me a slow, approving nod. Society loves to label women as cold or calculating when we choose logic over tears, when we use contracts instead of screaming matches to defend our boundaries. But protecting oneself legally does not make a woman cold, it makes her smart. It ensures her survival. I stood in the warm evening breeze, utterly untouchable, watching the crushing reality of their complete logistical and financial failure finally sink into the faces of the two traitors. They had tried to outsmart a woman whose daily profession was managing catastrophic crises, and they had lost everything in the process. Valerie desperately turned to Ethan, expecting him to fix the disaster, completely unaware that the worst secret of all was about to destroy them both. Valerie's fingers dug into the fabric of Ethan's suit jacket. Her wide, frantic eyes darted up to his face, silently begging him to assert his dominance, to pull a hidden ace from his sleeve and save them from this suffocating humiliation. She had hitched her wagon to a rising star, and she was waiting for him to shine. "Tell her it doesn't matter," Valerie hissed, her voice loud enough to carry across the quiet courtyard. "Tell her about the seed money. Tell her we don't need her pathetic savings because we have the private investor funds." I tilted my head, offering a soft, almost pitying sigh. Ah, yes, the private investor. I shifted my gaze from my trembling sister to the front row, where my mother was still standing. The adoring, tearful smile she had worn just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by an ashen pallor of confusion. "I think it's time we talk about your investor, Ethan," I said gently. "Because unlike you, I actually pay attention to my family's financial habits." I looked directly at my mother. "Mom, 3 weeks ago, Valerie came to you crying, didn't she? She told you she had an incredible, once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity, but she needed her inheritance early. She convinced you to take out a massive line of credit against your house. The house dad worked his entire life to pay off to fund her future." My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her chest. Ethan spun around to face Valerie, the remaining color draining from his face. Inheritance? He choked out, his voice cracking. You told me you had a private trust. You told me it was liquid capital that you controlled. You took out a loan against an old woman's house? Valerie stumbled back, her defensive instincts flaring. You told me you had $200,000 ready to go. You told me you were launching a luxury firm. And now what? You have $4,000? You just got fired in front of everyone, and you're going to get sued. Because I was relying on the capital you promised me, you idiot. Ethan roared, entirely abandoning his polished, gentlemanly persona. The mask had completely shattered. I risked my entire career, my reputation, my license, because you swore you had the financial backing to keep us afloat while I built the client roster. I am wearing a $15,000 dress, Valerie shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at him. I am not spending the rest of my life paying off a lawsuit for a broke, unemployed loser. You used me to get to my money. What money? Ethan screamed back, throwing his hands in the air. You don't have any money. You're a fraud. You're a leech who was trying to bleed me dry the second I made it big. Right there, under the romantic floral archway meant for sacred vows, the grand, sweeping romance they had so proudly announced minutes earlier disintegrated into a pathetic, vicious dogfight. They weren't star-crossed lovers making a brave leap for happiness. They were two parasites who had detached from their host, only to realize they had latched onto each other, and there was absolutely no blood left to suck. I stood quietly, my hands resting lightly in front of me, watching them tear each other to shreds. In the hospital, we have a term for this. When an infection is deprived of the oxygen and tissue it needs to survive, it begins to necrotize. It consumes itself. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to throw a drink or slap a face to get my revenge. Their own inherent greed, their towering narcissism, and their mutual desire to exploit one another did all the dirty work for me. But the most devastating casualty of the night was not Ethan's career or Valerie's pride. It was the woman standing in the front row. My mother began to tremble violently. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had always made excuses for Valerie. She had coddled her, protected her, and ultimately, she had financed her deepest betrayal. She had jeopardized her own retirement security, her peace of mind in her twilight years, all to fund an affair that was meant to destroy her younger daughter. Tears streamed down my mother's deeply lined face. She took a step forward, reaching a trembling hand out toward her eldest daughter, desperate for some kind of reassurance, some lie to soften the blow. "Valeria," she whispered, her voice fragile and broken. "My house, the money for my retirement. Please, tell me you didn't." Valerie, backed into a corner, publicly humiliated and stripped of her glamorous future, lashed out with the cruelty of a wounded animal. She swatted our mother's hand away. "Oh, for God's sake, Mom, back off!" Valerie snapped, her face twisted in ugly, selfish frustration. "Can't you see I'm dealing with my own ruined life right now? Stop making everything about you." The entire room inhaled sharply. The cruelty of that single sentence was absolute. My mother froze. Her extended hand slowly dropped to her side. For 39 years, I had watched this woman bend over backward to appease my sister's every whim. I had watched her sacrifice her own comfort, and mine, to keep Valerie happy. But in that agonizing, silent moment, the illusion of the golden child finally died. My mother did not argue. She did not cry out. She simply closed her eyes, turned her back on Valerie, and slowly walked back to her seat, staring blankly at the floor. It was a silent, devastating punishment, the complete and total withdrawal of the one person who had always been her safety net. Watching my mother's heartbreak brought me no joy, but it brought a profound sense of clarity. Sometimes, a surgeon must amputate a limb to save the patient's life. It is brutal, it is tragic, and it leaves a permanent scar. But cutting off the infection is the only way you can survive. Ethan and Valerie were finished. The guests were looking at them with open disgust. The venue manager was tapping her watch, signaling that their time was officially up. Breathing heavily, their faces flushed with rage and humiliation, they finally stopped screaming at each other. They had nothing left to say, and nowhere left to hide. As they finally turned to leave the venue in absolute disgrace, Valerie lifted the hem of the dress, prompting me to deliver one last piece of paperwork. The heavy, oppressive silence of the vineyard was broken only by the sound of Valerie's heels scraping against the stone pathway. Ethan had already turned his back on her, marching furiously toward the parking lot without a single backward glance. He was leaving her behind, abandoning the sinking ship they had built together. Valerie, abandoned and publicly disgraced, scrambled to follow him. She reached down, angrily lifting the delicate lace hem of my custom wedding gown to keep from tripping over it. "Valerie!" I called out, my voice calm and carrying effortlessly through the cool evening air. She froze, her shoulders tense. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes red-rimmed and venomous, expecting me to deliver one final insult or perhaps demand my dress back. Instead, I reached into my clutch and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. I walked toward her, my steps unhurried, and held it out. "You're forgetting your receipt." Valerie stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison. "What is this?" she whispered defensively. "It is the final invoice from the bridal boutique," I explained, maintaining the polite, detached tone I use when handing a patient their discharge papers. "When I called them yesterday to inform them that you would be picking up the dress for a surprise fitting, I also let them know that I was withdrawing my financial liability for the garment. Because of your overwhelming desire to wear it tonight, you willingly handed over your own premium credit card to the shop to act as a deposit just to get it out the door." Valerie's eyes widened, her gaze dropping to the dirt-smudged, wine-splattered hem of the ivory lace she was clutching in her fists. "The boutique's policy is ironclad," I continued, offering a serene, unflinching smile. "If the dress is worn outside, soiled, or altered in any unauthorized way, the deposit card is automatically charged for the remaining balance. I spoke to the manager an hour before I arrived here. Because you dragged it through the gravel courtyard and sweated in it while screaming at your unemployed boyfriend, the shop has officially refused any returns." I gently tucked the invoice into the bodice of the dress she was wearing. "Congratulations on your purchase, Valerie. The $15,000 final billing has already been transferred to your account. I hope the 5 minutes of feeling like a bride was worth the massive, inescapable consumer debt. Drive safely." Valerie looked down at the paper, then back up at me. The sheer magnitude of her financial ruin finally registered. She had no rich architect to pay it off, no mother with home equity to bail her out, and no dignity left to stand on. She let out a ragged, humiliated sob, turned on her heel, and practically ran out of the vineyard, a pathetic figure drowning in expensive, stolen lace. Once the toxic elements were finally removed, a profound physical shift occurred in the courtyard. The suffocating tension evaporated into the night sky. Mrs. Higgins, the venue manager, gave me a subtle, respectful nod and immediately signaled the waitstaff. Within seconds, the musicians picked up their instruments, playing a soft, uplifting jazz melody. I turned to the stunned crowd of friends, colleagues, and hospital staff. "The catering is fully paid for, the wine is already uncorked, and frankly, it is far too beautiful of an evening to waste," I announced, raising my own glass. "Please, stay, eat, drink, and celebrate with me." For a moment, they hesitated. But then, my mentor, a retired 60-year-old director of nursing, stood up, walked right over to me, and firmly clinked her glass against mine. To a brilliant diagnosis and a flawless excision, she toasted loudly. The rehearsal dinner transformed almost instantly. It was no longer the prelude to a wedding. It was a warm, vibrant celebration of my independence. As the night wore on, several older women in attendance approached me privately. These were women who had lived through decades of life's harsh realities, who understood the complexities of marriage and finance. One by one, they gripped my hands, their eyes shining with genuine admiration. "I stayed in a miserable marriage for 20 years because I didn't want to lose face," one woman whispered to me, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had a fraction of your courage at 39. You didn't lose anything tonight, my dear. You saved your own life." Their validation washed over me, affirming everything my instincts had screamed. Society often conditions women to believe that a failed engagement is a personal tragedy, a source of shame. But there is no shame in walking away from a burning building. The only tragedy would have been locking myself inside it. Hours later, after the final guests had hugged me goodbye and the waitstaff had begun clearing the tables, I found myself standing alone under the beautiful floral archway where I was supposed to say my vows tomorrow. I took a deep breath of the crisp, wine-scented air. I felt absolutely no bitterness. I felt no lingering heartbreak. All I felt was a profound, weightless relief. In my line of work, I see the devastating consequences of ignoring the truth. I had applied my professional objectivity to my own life, and it had saved me. I realized then that family is not defined merely by shared blood. It is defined by mutual respect, loyalty, and protection. Setting ironclad boundaries with my mother and my sister was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate, necessary act of self-love. I did not lose a husband tonight. I successfully dodged a catastrophic future. The surgery was agonizingly painful, yes. It required cutting away people I had known my entire life. But the infection was finally gone. The rot had been cleared out, leaving me completely, unequivocally free. And as I looked at the empty rows of seats, I realized that for the first time in my life, everything was finally in perfect order. Kristen's story concludes not just with a sense of vindication, but also leaves behind a profound stillness. From my personal perspective, this is an invaluable lesson in self-respect and the art of establishing ironclad boundaries in life. As women, we are often advised to endure and compromise to maintain peace, but blind indulgence sometimes only feeds the greed of selfish people. My sincere advice is to always maintain your independence, especially financial independence and a basic understanding of the law. Clearly defining these limits does not make you cold. Rather, it acts as a shield to protect your dignity and your future. Sometimes bravely walking away from toxic relationships, even with those closest to you, is the only way to save yourself. I would love to know what you think about Kristen's absolute calmness that night. If it were you, would you quietly prepare a sharp counterattack? Or would you choose to confront them immediately to release your emotions? Please leave a comment below sharing your perspective, because I believe that the listeners tuning in all have incredibly deep life experiences to share. If today's story resonated with you, please hit the subscribe button and share this video with the women around you. Your support and comments are the greatest motivation for me to continue bringing you more meaningful stories.